the steps that are needed to address the crisis in the short term and to make sure we don't have this happen in the future, broadly speaking, are fairly clear, and it just is a matter of the will and the effort and the hard work to get them done.
Right. If all of these steps had been in place a year ago, everything you proposed, do you think the current crisis would have been prevented or just ameliorated or just somewhat different than we have now?
Well, I wouldn't say a year ago, maybe a couple of years ago or 3 years ago. I think that we might not have avoided a period of stress, some boom and bust. As I mentioned at the beginning of my remarks, I do think that the large inflows of capital into the United States and other industrial countries did generate a period of excessive risk-taking and a boom mentality, which is not, it's part of the psychology of financial markets and probably cannot be entirely eradicated so long as we have innovative and dynamic markets. But having said that, I do think that if all this had been in place 2 or 3 years ago, that we'd be much better off today.
You're a famous student of the Federal Reserve during the Great Depression era. How would you say the Federal Reserve today is doing things differently than the Federal Reserve you studied during the Great Depression?
You're right that I spent a great deal of my academic career studying not just the Great Depression, but the whole general issue of how financial crises and financial distress affect the overall economy. And I must say that I always thought that I was way on the edge in terms of thinking how powerful these effects might be. There are many people in economics who say, well, you can let large financial firms fail, the market will take care of it, or these effects are second order. I hope that view is no longer seriously maintained, because I must say that having seen the power of financial crisis to address and to affect not just the U.S. economy, but the global economy, I'm more persuaded than ever that these effects are very real and very powerful, and that in trying to address the financial crisis, we are doing the best and most effective thing we can do to help the broader economy. To respond to your question, I learned basically 2 lessons from my studies of the Depression. The first is that monetary policy needs to be supportive, not contractionary. The Federal Reserve didn't understand what was going on. They were pursuing very orthodox policies constrained by the gold standard. But the effect of their policies was to create a powerful deflation of about 10% a year in the U.S. Between 1930 and 1933, which was extremely damaging. Friedman and Schwartz were among the first to point this out in their classic 1963 book. So one lesson to be learned is that monetary policy needs to be supportive in a period of crisis like this. And I'm sure everyone knows the Federal Reserve has taken this to heart. We've been very aggressive. We've cut rates now to essentially to zero. And we did that very quickly. Other countries are now following our lead. And we are now augmenting those conventional monetary policies with new, creative, unconventional policies to try and have additional impact on financial conditions. So that was the first lesson. The second lesson is that, to reiterate what I said before, is that when the financial system breaks down, becomes highly unstable, then that has very severe adverse effects on the economy. Once again, this was something that was not handled. The Federal Reserve did not intervene to stop the failure of about 1/3 of all the banks in the United States. Globally, there were massive bank failures. I think perhaps the most critical, in May of 1931, the Credit Anstalt, which was one of the largest banks in Europe, failed, which generated a wave of financial crisis around the world. Up till early 1931, arguably the 1929 downturn was just a ordinary, severe but ordinary downturn. It was the financial crises and the collapse of banks and other institutions in late 1930 and early 1931 that made the Great Depression great. And so we must have a commitment to stabilize our banking system, to prevent the failures of any large systemically critical firms, and going forward to find stronger rules, regulations, mechanisms to make sure we're not put in this situation where we are dealing with these too big to fail firms, which is obviously very detrimental to the market discipline and to the functioning of the economy in the longer term.
Final question before we go to the audience. Right now, do you see the recession we're in likely to end by the end of this year, early next year? Do you think we've hit the bottom yet, or can you make any comments about the depth and length of the recession?
Well, my forecasting record on this recession is about the same as the win-loss record of the Washington Nationals. It has surprised us in being more severe than anticipated, but again, I think the main lesson that's been learned is how powerful and how pervasive these financial market effects can be. But so the way I would phrase my answer would be to say that it depends critically on our ability to get the banking system and the financial system more broadly, not necessarily back to 2005, but back to a situation where the markets are reasonably stable and they can perform their critical function of providing credit to the economy. If we can do that, then I think that there's a good chance that the recession will end later this year and that 2010 will be a period of growth.
Okay, thank you. First question, Arnaud. Can you just, and everybody please identify, give your name, identify an organization you might be with, or if you don't have one, just give your name.
Mr. Chairman, Arnaud de Borchgrave, CSIS. Since the end of the Cold War, we've been watching democratic capitalism gradually morph into casino capitalism, and since the Enron scandal, into bandit capitalism. We've been warned time and again about derivatives being a gigantic time bomb that could really blow up the system. Haven't we, in a sense, been watching capitalism sowing the seeds of its own destruction?
I wouldn't put it that way. I think we must obviously I wouldn't put it that way. I think, though, that seriously, that we have to remember, first of all, that capitalism, broadly construed, has been an enormous success. I mean, it has been, in various forms, it has been the source of essentially all of the remarkable growth that we've seen in the world economy in the last 150 years. The Chinese established their growth path only once they began to adopt market mechanisms. The United States has, through its use of market mechanisms, has reached the level of economic sophistication and power that we have achieved. So capitalism, to my mind, is still easily the only real alternative for organizing economies if our goal is to improve the standards of living of average people. That being said, one aspect of capitalism, and this is something that goes back again for hundreds of years, is that the financial sector, while very important and critical for allocating resources to new industries, to new products, has been prone to booms and busts. Some of them are perhaps inherent. People differ on exactly what the sources of those booms and busts are. If you're a Minskyite, you would say it's inherent in the dynamics, the psychology of those markets. An alternative viewpoint would be that it has to do with the governmental structure that surrounds those markets and constrains or incentivizes those markets. So what we're dealing with is a particular part of capitalism, which is the financial boom and bust, which has been around for a very long time. I think that we can use financial markets effectively to provide resources to new industries, new products, to be innovative, to drive growth, at the same time that we can at least mitigate, if not eliminate, these booms and busts and these adverse crises that we've had in the recent years. And I've tried to give some suggestions today. I think, if there's any silver lining to this, I hope that we will learn, what mistakes were made, that we will figure out how to create a framework in which we can benefit from the vitality and creativity of the financial system without allowing it to create these highly destructive crises that we've seen, as like the one recently.
Right here. Go ahead.
Jim Moody, Merrill Lynch. A great deal has been said about mark-to-market and both its need for transparency. Sorry. The mark-to-market rule has been both assailed as pro-cyclical and very destabilizing. It's also perceived as something quite necessary for transparency. Can you comment on this back-and-forth debate over that issue? Thank you.
Yes, I talked about mark-to-market in my remarks as one of the aspects of potential pro-cyclicality, one of the things that tends at times to increase the severity of ups and downs in the financial system and in the economy. First of all, let me just say that I strongly endorse the basic proposition behind mark-to-market, which is that we should make our financial institutions' balance sheets as transparent, as clear as possible. It's much better, the system works much better when investors know what firms are worth and what they're holding on their balance sheets. And increasing transparency going forward, I didn't talk much about that today, but it's something that we as regulators are already working on, and I think there are a number of steps that can be taken in general to further increase transparency. So the general principle that, that assets should be marked to market when possible, and there should be maximum transparency, is one that I certainly support. And I would not support any suspension of mark to market, anything like that. However, we all acknowledge, and I think even the strongest proponents of mark to market acknowledge, that